So, good afternoon. Welcome, everybody, to the first in our 2025 season of Talking Towns, which is brought to you by UCD's Centre for Irish Towns. The session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel after the session is complete. I'll ask you all to mute your microphones while we proceed. So my name is Stephen Wall. I'm an architect and researcher, currently carrying out a PhD on the low carbon transition of Irish towns and specifically the role that the new European Bauhaus can play in this transition. I also sit on the working group of UCD's Centre for Irish Towns. Now, the centre is aimed at building a network of people interested in Irish towns and generating conversations about the challenges facing towns and the role of research and policy in addressing these challenges. So the Talking Towns webinars are one of our key mechanisms for doing this. The series is curated and coordinated this year by myself and Dr. Anna Skura, who you can see there on your screen. Anna is a postdoctoral fellow and project leader of the Building Stories project, and we are assisted in this task by our colleague Alva Beatty. We will have 3 webinars in spring and early summer this year. This is the first, and more details will be released in due course for the following sessions, and then we will have 3 more in the autumn. So watch this space for the May June sessions. All previous sessions are available on the Centre for Irish Towns YouTube channel, and we've had some very interesting discussions, so I'd like to encourage you to check those out. Today, we are focused on Irish attitudes to urbanism. So just to give a little background, here at the Centre for Irish Towns, we are interested in all aspects of town sustainability, from ecological to economic to social. Our research seeks to address the complex challenges faced by towns across the country. Now, during my master's in architecture, urbanism and climate action in UCD, I started to investigate the Irish attitudes specifically to cosmopolitanism. And in doing so, I became interested in the question of whether conflicting attitudes to urbanism could be playing a part in the sort of urban malaise that we are interested here in the Centre for Irish Towns that seems to be affecting Irish towns across the country. I discovered a sense during my studies that at various times in Irish history, towns have been viewed as alien, foreign, sinful, or indeed agents of colonial repression. The apparent lack of urban settlements in Gaelic Ireland gave way to the establishment of urban settlements by a succession of migrant peoples, which led to Gaelic revivalists and independence activists to adopt a pro-rural idyll as their vision for an independent Ireland. So today's session is an opportunity to interrogate these topics, learn a little more about them, and ask if attitudinal biases do play a role in the urban issues facing towns. And if so, how may we address these to engender more positive attitudes to urbanism and town vitality? So to explore these points, we have 3 speakers who will each address the topic from a slightly different vantage point. We have John Malloy, who will discuss aspects of urban history in Ireland. Thank you, John, for joining us. We have Miriam Fitzpatrick, who will talk about the concept of urban attitudes in relation to towns. Now, Miriam sadly can't be with us today, but she has sent her remarks by video, which I will share later. And finally, we have architect Mick Ford Bradley, who will present a more personal take on the social benefits of compact town and village living. So at the end of the session, we will have a questions and answers. So if any questions occur to you over the course of the speakers, you can pop them in the chat and just mention who the question is aimed at, and we will get to these at the end of the session. So first up, we have John Malloy. He graduated with a BA in Visual Communication from the National College of Art and Design in Dublin in 1983, and subsequently worked both UK and Ireland in the sign trade and in community arts and in a wide variety of settings, from psychiatric hospitals and prisons to reception centres for asylum seekers and refugees. In 2004, John joined the Atlantic Technological University as a lecturer in art history and theory, chaired the BA in Contemporary Art Practices programme, and also taught on the Applied Social Care programme. In 2006, he completed a PhD exploring collectivity, culture, and globalisation. He's published book chapters and essays, most recently co-edited Against the Grain, a 2004 publication, collection of essays on community development in the west of Ireland. And John retired from the Atlantic Technological University in 2024. The title of John's presentation today is The Irish Town, a Horrible Perversion of the Natural Order. So, John, with that provocative title, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Stephen. And I feel a bit like I'm here under false pretenses because I am not an architect. So that's the first thing. But anyway, I will proceed. Hang on, sorry. Sorry, my screen went blank. I'm trying to share here. Screen, broadcast. Okay. Sorry. Apologies. Slideshow from start. Okay, so the Irish town, a horrible perversion of the natural order. This is a line from Ada Blockham's book, What Sinn Féin Stands For, from 1921. And the reason why he kind of thought like that hopefully will become a bit clear. So what I'm going to do is to look at this through four different kind of themes. The first is the idea of the town as a colonial imposition, and I'm connecting that obviously to colonialism as such. Then secondly, the town and the topography of power, and that really is going to center around capitalism, and then the notion of class in this kind of classless Ireland idea, and then finally towns and the rhetoric of the new plantation that we see in current kind of far-right rhetoric. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. It's really to give an overview of some of the historical ideas around anti-urbanism. So this is an image from John Derrick's The Image of Ireland, which was a book that was published in 1581. And this is the Gaelic chieftain with his warrior and his attendant in the wild, empty Irish rural landscape. And this has been the image of Ireland that has been around since the beginnings of the colonial conquest. This is during the time of Henry Sidney, who was the Lord Deputy of Ireland. So we're talking the 1570s, the period of the First Desmond Rebellion, that kind of idea. So we have these Gaelic people living strange lives, wearing different clothes to the English. They have these long baggy sleeves on their shirts. They're in this empty landscape. And by contrast, we have the English gentleman riding out, going forth with Mars in his noble train to conquer the wild Irish. Sidney was notorious as a Lord Deputy, extremely violent, involved in lots of massacres, probably the most famous one being the Massacre of Mullamask, 1578. The kind of idea really is the town as the center of power. And this is a feature from the beginning of the Anglo-Irish settlement. So we have medieval and early modern Ireland with this kind of mix of peoples focused in the towns, primarily on the edges of the country, but not entirely. But it is a bit more complicated than that. I mean, Stephen was mentioning earlier that Gaelic Ireland was largely rural. There were the monastic settlements. There were towns like Cavan that were founded by the O'Reillys of Breffni and so on. But by and large, the towns were alien, they were English. And then there were minorities of people like Gaelic people holding property and fee, which is the equivalent of a full ownership, but with usually an English name on the title deed. There were the Os people who were descendants largely of the Vikings who had become Gaelicized. You find them in places like County Wexford, Waterford, places like that. There were Scottish people, there were Welsh people. But there were a whole series of legal barriers intended to separate and exclude the wild Irish as they were known from the towns, most famous being the Statutes of Kilkenny. And they did regulate things like dress, hairstyles, language, names, all of those sort of things. So Irish people were very much actively excluded. And the famous Galway bylaw, neither O nor Mac should strut nor swagger through the streets of Galway. So this idea of exclusion, active exclusion like that. That led to the development of what we might call the Irish towns. They were known as Irish towns or Baile Gaelic in outside the edge of different towns. The photograph is the Claddagh in Galway, shortly before its demolition. It was a major project of the new state to get rid of a poverty-stricken settlement like this on the edge of a town. Bandon is the map in the background, and you might be able to see over here on the right-hand side, there's the Irish town on the edge of the town, and this is also the site of the Union Workhouse, and that's a fairly common association, that these kind of spaces that were reserved for the Irish outside the town proper were associated with poverty, with deprivation, and later on with institutional provision, so to speak, incarceration. Bandon is an interesting town. It was set up in the early 17th century by the Beechers following the plantation of Munster. And one of the key bylaws of the town was that no Roman Catholic was allowed to live in the town. So there was an inscription over the gate of the town that entrance was for Jew, for Turk, for atheist, but no papist could enter here. So that idea, the town itself was built on exclusion. So that's really the kind of key notion. We saw in the Henry Sidney writing out from Dublin, the traitors' heads were on the gate, that kind of idea. So, the rebels are out of the town. Okay, if we move quickly on to the early 18th century, I'm going to use Westport as an example because the town I know best, basically. And what I want to do is to explore the idea of capitalism and the town, and how the town became a kind of a capitalist imposition, so to speak, on a non-capitalist society. So I'm going to, the description of capitalism that I use is one developed by Utsa and Prabhat Patnaik. They're two Indian writers, and they describe capitalism as the taking of land, raw materials, and bodies from a non-capitalist mode of production. So that's really the idea. So you have a society that's in a non-capitalist mode, and then you have the imposition of a capitalist mode. So there was a medieval quay, and there was some sort of settlement around this area and around here. This is all flat land. There's the river flowing through, and there are two ridges either side of that valley where the river is. And this is a very steep hill, okay? So the Browns, they were English settlers who came from Sussex. In the early 17th century, they had territory around the Neil in South Mayo. After the Cromwellian Wars ended, the Acts of Settlement, they got land around Westport in 1677, and they were involved in the Jacobite Wars on the Jacobite side. So they lost some of their land, but following the Treaty of Limerick 1691, they were able to hold on to their territory and gradually began to consolidate their activity around the area that was to become Westport. In the early 18th century, obviously being Catholic was a major disadvantage. So John Brown, at some stage in the early period of the 18th century, converted to Protestantism and became an MP and was able to secure his estate, and gradually began the project of creating a new town. This was followed on by his son Peter. Around 1750 we're talking about. So we have the people from this area who are down on the flat land are evicted up to the top of a very steep hill. So access to the sea in particular is up this really, really steep hill. And a domain wall is built around this flat ground where Westport House is built in 1731. Okay, this was the old ring fort on top of the hill, viewing out over the sea. But there had been a kind of an O'Malley stronghold roughly where Westport House is. This is the oldest part of the town, up at the very top of the hill. And then the institutions of the state become developed also on the top of the hill. So we'll show what that means for the people in the town. So this is an overview of the town from roughly 1792. So we can see the town, all the people are here living. There's the domain wall, which is about 12 feet high, with trees to the outside of it, skirting along the entirety of the town. There's the huge workhouse up on top of the hill, overlooking the town. And then, just to make doubly sure that you know who's in charge, the barracks is looking down on you. So what does this look like from the town itself? This is from the oldest part of the town up on the top of the hill. So you can get an idea of how steep it is. One major trouble for the people in the town was getting stuff to and from the quay. Meant that you had to pull everything with a horse and cart up these hills, and lots of horses died and slipping and falling and so on. And the other thing was the barracks is to our right over here, about 150 meters away, And then to the left, there's still an empty piece of ground, which is where the gallows was erected during the 1798 rebellion and remained the town gallows for a long time and was visible from, again, the center point of the town. So again, we have this assertion of authority through the geography, the topography of the town. And we can see again, this is the view up the main street, which is Bridge Street, and the barracks up at the top of the hill. Again, no doubt as to who's in charge. To build this town was based on, first of all, Peter Brown marrying Elizabeth Kelly, who was a Jamaican estate holder in Altamont in Jamaica. And the money that came through the slave plantations enabled in line with that same kind of extractive thinking of capitalism. The town was originally built to be a linen producing town. That was the idea, that they would set up a linen trade. It didn't really work, so they reverted to livestock, which involved obviously the eviction of a lot of people over the course of the 19th century. They were huge landlords. They had about 115,000 acres in County Mayo alone by the mid-late 19th century. So, you know, this was serious power and money going on here. The other thing was timber and stone was also exported from the area. There were lots of beech trees, particularly on the north side of Clubay, and they were exported in the 19th century. There was also stone from along the shores, was used for cobblestones. There's a bar across Clubay, and that became a major source of revenue for the Browns, exporting that to be used as cobblestones in the likes of Glasgow and so on. So this idea that this place was a source of raw materials and it was basically a non-capitalist mode of production in the hinterland, and this was an extractive landscape, and the town is a mechanism to facilitate that, but with this assertion of power. That's kind of what I'm trying to explain. So the main focus of the town was this canalized river on the flat with the gates into the domain, and then the big high domain wall. And then this is the spire of the Church of Ireland Church, which was built in 1868. So very much this kind of topography of power, as I'm calling it. Okay, so we move on to the third theme, which is class. And what I want to do is a quick overview of the book by Ada Blockham. He was born Harold Saunders Blackham in London to a good English mother and an Ulster Protestant father, but became converted to Catholicism and became a rabid Irish nationalist, basically. But this was a handbook for English-speaking readers in 1921 to understand the Sinn Féin movement. And the idea was that Ireland was to be a rural polity based on distributed property organized cooperatively, and it would be the world's working model of a Catholic state. The horrible perversion of the natural order found in towns was to wither away. The natural order was based on three key principles: order, authority, and obedience. So we can see that there's kind of a proto-fascist idea going on in some of this. And that these perversions, these contradictions of order, authority, and obedience was found in the towns because there was a diversity of population, particularly class war was a big concern in the book. And the idea was that this would be replaced by community and the decentralization of all industry and services. So the various classes would be distributed across the country. This would lead to a reduction in class identity. It had solved the problem with the slums and so on. And there'd be a new collectivism based on community, which was to be the new Gaelic social ideal, that notion. And this, I mean, de Blockham wasn't alone in this. This was widespread kind of thought within the Sinn Féin movement, and De Valera in particular was very heavily influenced by de Blockham's ideas. The Sinn Féin handbook is up there on the top left, and a lot of the paintings of the empty landscape, which again echo back to Derrick and his images from 1581, this became the image. So the official handbook of the new state, for example, the chapter on fishing, the fishing industry, is two lads in a curragh. You know, it's that kind of idea. There are almost no images. There are a few, 2 or 3 images of towns in the official handbook. Otherwise, it's a depopulated Irish landscape. The real Ireland is this empty space. And you can see the early ad for Aer Lingus. It's, again, the Paul Henry image. This reached a kind of a weird level of auto-exoticism, as Joe Gleason's term for it, where people kind of reinvented themselves. There's a cross between sort of Old El Paso and Ballydahab sort of thing in Sean Keating's Irish Free State Chicken. This was meant to be a poster advertising chicken to the English market, but they look fairly strange, really, in a way, the colors and so on. But there is this is a common feature in the paintings of the 1920s and 30s. This, as I say, making ourselves anything but English. So this kind of strangeness, and the ruralness is part of that. England is associated with towns and cities and industries. So we're not that. So we have to be rural and depopulated and so on. This kind of notion of ruralism arguably hindered the modernization of the country. I mean, people like Tom Inglis and so on would have argued that. And it did persist well into the Lemass era. So it is, was a very important idea. So if we come to the fourth bit of this, we've looked at very briefly the idea of colony, of capitalism, and of class. This class diversity was the issue. Does this connect to contemporary racism? Does this idea spill over, the anti-urbanism of this early nationalism? Does it survive in the contemporary Irish far-right rhetoric, particularly around notions of diversity and urban dangers in particular? I think, we can't say it causes it, but I think there are maybe slight echoes within it. And then the other thing is it's shot through a bit like the Irish Free State Chicken image, with a kind of American cinematic sensibility, the notion of the hero as the rugged cowboy in the empty landscape. The city is this kind of concrete jungle, that kind of idea. So it's just to kind of think through some of these questions. That's really all I'm trying to look at. And this notion in the nationalist imaginary of the importance of a homogenous community, that kind of idea, that community, Zygmunt Bauman described a community, you exchange liberty for security. So this idea of security, if you don't have community, you're in danger. And danger is the big threat in a lot of the far-right rhetoric. And the danger is located in the towns where the diverse population is, that kind of question. And that seems to be an old cultural feature in the Irish thinking around countryside and towns. So that's kind of the question I'm posing. So yeah, whoops, sorry, I will try to stop sharing, sorry.
Thank you very much, John, for that fascinating talk. Very interesting and lots of food for thought there. And just to say, there's no need to be bashful about not being an architect. The Centre for Irish Towns is very much interdisciplinary, and we welcome input from all fields. But thanks a million again. So our next talk is Miriam Fitzpatrick. Dr. Miriam Fitzpatrick, my colleague here in UCD. Miriam can't be with us today, but she has submitted some comments that I can play as video. Miriam is an assistant professor, lecturer, and researcher here in urban design in UCD. She completed a PhD on the work of urbanist William Hollywhite and has contributed a chapter on Irish urban attitudes to the recent publication Irish Cities in Crisis. Miriam also sits on the working group of the Centre for Irish Towns, and the title of Miriam's presentation today is Asking the Why. So bear with me while I share Miriam's talk, and if there's any problem hearing or seeing this, please let me know.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks very much for the invitation to talk about urban attitudes in Ireland. Just in case I can't log in on the day of the Talking Towns, I'm pre-recording this so that you can use it. And I'm going to start with a sort of rather bleak photograph, and it's of my hometown in Claremorris, County Mayo. And I want to make the point that this range of buildings once housed a bank, a pub, an undertaker, a butcher, and across the road a train station, but now all stands derelict. And it's that site that has motivated me to be an active urbanist and I guess to continually ask why. And that why gets us to attitude. I wrote a few chapters recently for a publication on Irish cities in crisis, and I came to the realization that one of the reasons for a crisis is that made me think about, was this in part a self-made, that was to do with our attitude that caused it. So chapter 3.3 is exactly on the topic of urban attitudes in Ireland. So feel free to read this, but I'm going to make a few points from it. I'm going to start with value. We must therefore look beyond the blueprints to ask what values are embedded in the plans. And this is a quote by William Holly White, urbanist, in an article he wrote called The Anti-City in 1963. And why is this relevant? A conflicted attitude towards urbanism in Ireland is often underestimated or maybe even underexpressed. Yet many urban insertions with a hint of hostility reveal a deeply anti-urban attitude and fail to respect one of the key fundamental principles of street-based urbanism, and that is building to the street edge and building that edge with porosity and life. Otherwise, we rob the street of its lifeline, its people, and the life along its edges is missing, making it a worse place, I guess, to hang out socially and for walking in terms of safety. So why do I say this? So during a period of unparalleled economic and population growth in Ireland, our urban cores of towns have hollowed out. I'm showing here a beautiful map of Clonmel, showing in blue its extended suburbs. To understand this phenomena of towns effectively turning inside out, sprawling on their edges, I've read extensively about historical attitudes of pro and anti-urban attitudes and predispositions. So a definition might assist us. Attitude is a settled behaviour, a manner of acting, a frame of mind, a mindset. Attitude is a settled way of thinking or feeling about something. By definition, attitude captures a kind of form of inertia. It requires more effort to change than to stick with the status quo. That means that we need a kind of an intellectual alertness to think again. But staying curious requires emotional muscle, and that's one of the key purposes of the Talking Town series, to make us more inquisitive, to help us to look and look again, and also to weigh up our personal decisions and collective roles that contribute to the shaping and quality of our towns as places. So what does attitude have to do with towns? As I say, in just one generation, we have witnessed not just rapid growth, but a rapid decline in the centre of our towns. And really that's led to the decline of one of our most valuable, now vulnerable, heritage assets, urban centres and their street-based forms right across the land. Is it time to ask whether an Irish attitude to urban planning and urban design has contributed to the blight of so many places? Dereliction, vacancy, these are signs of a misuse of resources and misaligned policy. Why? In the absence of coordinated or self-consciously designed plans, i.e. urban design, our towns and cities typically evolve through the accumulation of piecemeal, pragmatic investments, but infrastructure that meets various ends. So I'm going to quote Jonathan Barnett, Professor of Urban Design at the University of Pennsylvania, when he says, therefore, that our towns are therefore not an accident. Their forms are usually unintentional, but not accidental. It is the product of decisions made for single and separate purposes, whose interrelationships and side effects have not been fully considered. So let me just restate this. Vacancy and blight are unintentional, but not accidental. They are symptoms of an underlying attitude. Part of that attitude involves a benign neglect of design at a grand scale and resource use, which is of land use, urban design, and the quality of the urban open spaces that we inhabit. And yet we have inherited a model of ideal settlement patterns in our towns and cities that few can improve on. So we have this conflicted view of urbanism. Typically, and here I'm showing Clonmel, we have a fabric of urban settlements consisting of enclosing edges. I often think of it like crowds at a fair or friends gathered at a gathering. Individual units press up against each other, creating recognisable spaces such as town squares, diamonds, linear markets, and a range of street types. Our OS maps in Ireland attest to this long pattern of urban morphology. The terrace house has served as our inventive and flexible urban unit, facilitating proximity, diverse uses, subdivisions, and backlands, often for food or else additional work and living spaces. The street is our urban environment par excellence. Street-based urbanism brought the units together. Public spaces served as their connection. And like friends around a table, the units always face each other. Therefore, we have an example of not only great urbanism, but also places that hold significance for so many across the whole country. So how and why has our attitude towards street-based urbanism changed? Some blame the car. Ever since the combustion engine saved us many onerous tasks, it has added another, the hidden cost of distance. I'm going to quote John McGahern here, because he stated so accurately. Ireland is a peculiar society in the sense that it was a 19th century society up till around 1970, and then it almost bypassed the 20th century. McGahern is very relevant because in 1974, the Ford Escort was Ireland's #1 bestseller. It's also around this time that foreign direct investment contributed much to our lagging economy. And with our newfound wealth, we embraced the car. And we also moved. We moved outwards. And it was easy to build outwards. And we embraced the convenience that facilitated. But this decentralisation as a pattern of development has not stopped. So has our attitude towards urbanism been born out of other facts, say historical? Well, I'm going to spare you planning history, but I do want to point out, I guess, 3 elements. Since the founding of our state, there's been very little support for 3-dimensional urban design and its possibilities of spatial skill set. Likewise, planning institutions have been treated with suspicion, emerging as planning did from a distributed suburban ideal, often that married with anti-urban sentiments of the Celtic revival around the same time as Garden City ideals. And that fitted well with ideologies of church and state at the formation of this nation. Notably, however, there have been exceptions, and these have often been preconditions imposed from outside. So the United Nations kicked off our planning system in the 60s, and this wonderful image by Sean O'Leary captures this engineer who woke up one morning to discover that he was indeed a planner. Other initiatives from the outside, the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD, demanded on a number of occasions that we think our rethink our plans and have urban designers involved to think at a bigger picture and at the closer detail of places. And that happened in the 80s for Dublin Docklands and Temple Bar. And more recently, the EU taxonomy from last year demands that we account for sprawl by tracking our use of limited resources. So the car and convenience has allowed us to spread, but no one has tallied the cost. The ease of allowing 10 acres to do the job of one has come with a heavy cost socially, environmentally, and in terms of our infrastructure. A few facts. The Irish urbanisation rate of 63% is the lowest among our 36 members of the OECD. Ireland also has 4 times the European average length of networks. That is wires, cables per capita, a fact that recent storms have really highlighted. So retrospective compact growth is quite difficult and costly. It's hard to reverse the spread. But who costed the infrastructure of that sprawling pattern? I would say that no one kept the score. But now the cost of retrofitting urban areas is being calculated, often by private interests, developers, and homeowners often bear the cost. So we're very vocal now about the cost of everything to do with building. Too few have addressed the hidden costs of infrastructure as we spread, and we continue to do so. So if the state of our towns in any way breaks your heart like it breaks mine, don't just mourn. Ask, how did we arrive at this point? That question might inspire you and others to navigate to find more facts. So I'm going to conclude with some corrective action, something that we might do to assist returnees who are eager to take advantage of the wonderful convenience of urban centres. Canada, for instance, since at least 20 years, has identified comparative costs per household of how we build, or how they build, compact living versus sprawl. And to my knowledge, these comparative costs of infrastructure per household are seldom mentioned in Ireland. So might it benefit to have these calculated and then published? Second, I think we also need exemplars of towns thriving. And I'm returning here to Mayo and to my town again. A former county manager in Mayo warned me that we lived in a democracy, and by that he meant he couldn't be seen to favour one town over a dozen others. And yet that's exactly what we need to see, is one town thriving in a large extent, not just a small plaza or a square here or there, but a full town lived in and thriving. So we therefore need political courage to turn this tide, or political will. And some might label that attitude. So to conclude with a little hope, I'm working on a special edition of the Urban Design Journal for an Irish edition with Alan and me. And this will be due later this year. And we're going to focus on optimism. We want to begin by talking about soft power of social infrastructure, the people behind the plans. And why is that? For after all, it is the people who like living in towns who make them attractive to people who don't. It's people who bring towns to life, often people with attitude. Thank you.
So thanks to Miriam Fitzpatrick for that contribution. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope everyone was able to hear it okay. So just before we move on to our third speaker, Mick Bradley, I would just like to remind you that if any questions occur to you over the course of the session, please pop them in the chat, and we'll have a short Q&A at the end. I think we'll have time for that. So now we turn to Michael Bradley. Mick is an architect and sustainability expert. He spent 15 years living and working in Copenhagen as co-owner of CISO Architects before moving to Cloughjordan, County Tipperary. where he was drawn to the established eco-village located there. He works with Limerick City and County Council as Senior Executive Architect in the Housing Department. Mick is active in several mixed tenure housing schemes in Limerick City and County Council with a focus on sustainable living and people-focused public realm. Mick's presentation today is titled The Irish Village Community Living. So Mick, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, John. Thanks, Mariam. You can hear me okay there, Steve, can you? Okay, and I'll just bring up my first slide and you might just give me is that showing full screen for you guys?
No, just go to your display settings at the top there, Mick, again, and just swap it, yes. Okay, perfect.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, wow, intriguing chats so far. Really interesting to hear some maybe a little bit more academic in-depth reasoning behind some of the Irish psyche. So I suppose my own talk here today is going to be, I suppose, dripping off my experience in Denmark over the last 15 years. So in short, I'm an architect and sustainable planner. I moved with my family to Denmark in 2005 and was there for 15 years and came back some 4 years ago to Cloughjordan in County Tipperary. So I suppose we tend to only remember 3 points from these kinds of talks. So I suppose I want you to try and remember that our needs change throughout our lifetimes. Social systems and new ways of living together closer and safer, and a vision for your own 50 to 100 years as a resident of Ireland. And indeed, what's next for Irish towns and villages, and in essence, that's up to us. So I suppose very shortly, 42 years and 10 seconds, I grew up in Borherbui, which was a sheep farm out in the middle of the countryside. Worked in Ireland before I moved to Denmark, worked in all of the Irish cities. And I suppose was dropped into a world in Denmark where we had Jan Gehl having pedestrianized the city centre over 40 years. So kind of heavily influenced by the idea of if you remove cars from public space, you create space for all. And I suppose in moving to Denmark, the only thing I knew at the time was that it wasn't Cork and they had a red and white flag. And it was kind of a baptism of fire with moving there. But 15 years later, 3 kids and my own architectural company for 10 years, we'd done some interesting projects. So back in 2015, I began speaking at a series of Irish events and began to see, well, I suppose in many ways how far ahead the Danes were on some aspects, and also the potential for Ireland and how it is to live in the place that you're from, if I put it to you like that. And at the same time, we experienced a number of climate disasters in Copenhagen from 2010 to 2019. And it got myself and my wife, Julia, very much thinking of, okay, where is the safest place going to be to live over the next 50 years if it's more likely to get worse before it gets better? And basically a moderately climate freshwater island off the west coast of Europe seemed like a good idea in terms of what might come over the next 20 to 30 years. So we actively began to think about moving back to Ireland, which we did then in 2020. And we moved to Cloughjordan, which is a delightful little village at the centre of Ireland. Those people may know it as the location for the Cloughjordan Eco Village as well. So what you see here in the plan to the right is the original, I suppose, arterial developed Cloughjordan village town itself, and then the Eco Village off that. So I suppose in choosing Cloughjordan as opposed to Clonakilty or Cove, for example, because we're originally from Cork, a number of things were kind of at the fore for us. And one was the idea that, well, myself and my wife were getting older, but also in general, Irish people getting older, 25% of us over 65 by now, basically. These slides are a couple of years old. And I suppose we were battling with the idea of the Irish ideal, I will die in my own bed, thank you very much, 'tis my land, which is kind of in this slide is an amalgamation of Bull McCabe and maybe the idea that to have made it in Irish society, one has to have the 2-story house with the 4 cars out the front, which might be interesting to hear John's opinion of whether that's kind of a harping back to the idea of a landlord living in that kind of dwelling and us being the poorer folk, and to have made it, one has to become the landlord. But I'll leave John come in on that. So I suppose what became clear to me was the idea of Irish sprawl leading to Irish loneliness. Now, in some of the work we've done since that, I'm aware of the fact that actually rural Ireland tends to have quite closely knit communities who look after each other, where actually cities and city spaces tend to have more lonely elderly people. They're more invisible in cities than they are in the countryside. But it did spawn the idea of what kind of life do we want to live and with whom, and this idea of life after retirement in Ireland, that we don't necessarily have a vision for that, where the Danes are much more, I suppose, holistic in their visions for what constitutes a fulfilled existence. So I was asking, do we have a vision for life in Ireland past retirement, and do I, for example? So for me, it was going to be focused around family and activity, and not spending the rest of our lives in Denmark in a way. And the idea of the crack in community in Ireland is something you just don't get anywhere else in the world. So it began to spawn this idea of an Ireland one would want to grow old in, and recognizing the need for life after retirement. And also that Ireland's housing crisis is not just that we need more housing, we also need to look at how we want to live our lives from 60 to 100. So I kind of became inspired with the idea of building a new vision for the life that awaits the 65-year-old, 100-year-old Irish person, inspired by some of the stuff coming out of Denmark. And in many of the visits, this is actually the pub in Cloughjordan, I was really realizing that the Irish pub is this kind of glue, societal glue, that is being looked for in Denmark in new builds. We kind of have it in the center of our villages. Now, there's definitely a move away from alcohol as the center of our, community existence, and I fully support that. But I do think that it's an under-realized resource and community gel that just isn't readily available, certainly not in Copenhagen. So in choosing to move to the eco-village, there were several reasons, I suppose. One of the main was that they have a farm on the lands of the actual eco-village. Now, the other was that there was, 3 pubs within moving distance of where we were going to move to. And I think that's a kind of maybe a key driver about how one imagines one's life beyond 65, that maybe car-based transport is not the way, or definitely isn't the way forward as one ages. And aging in community was something that was quite inspiring. So food security was a key driver for myself and my wife, the idea that we wanted to move somewhere. This is the aerial view of the farm in Cloughjordan. So they supply vegetables 2 times a week to the common house, to more than 80 families here in the eco-village. And that's really been inspiring to watch it evolve over the last 4 or 5 years. I'm on the board at the moment of the Cloughjordan eco-village, or the farm basically. And it's evolved into something that is now also having, themed music nights and larger events. And it's very much open to all ages. And I think that was what I was finding so inspiring. So when we looked for a place to move to in Ireland, we were looking from the basis of this idea of multi-generational living and a kind of a shared economic way of thinking, and for new drivers for how we want to live. So some examples from Denmark that were inspiring us at the time, and some background for why we were thinking like that. So if you think of yourself as an Irish person, you could meet Timmy, let's say Timmy. And Timmy could, for example, there'd be 2 ways Timmy could go. He could either have worse health and need greater levels of care, depending on how he lives his life, basically, at the age of 70. Or he could be a group which, could well live on to 100. Either way, we're going to live longer and have different visions for how we're going to live. And I suppose we began a PhD in Denmark from 2015 to 2020, where it was focused on this idea that there will be 2 ways of living life going forward. So Timmy could either, if one looks at Timmy's societal interaction throughout his lifespan, as we, approach 20 until we have family, we actually are quite active. When we have family, if you have family, you dip into your looking after kids phases. And then, you kind of tailor off at 50 to a certain level, depending on who you are as a person. That's one way that people could live. And there's our housing envelope, basically, with the 4-bedroom house is catering to that level of society where you basically at 25 partner up and go off and have kids. We also have student housing that cater for that part, and some, elderly housing in Ireland, or elderly care centres for the older part, but wouldn't be super desirable. Nothing like you could see in the Danish model. So I suppose I became quite interested in the idea that, well, what happens if you don't accept, let's say, loneliness out in the countryside at 50, and you decide to do something where you don't maintain your level of societal interaction that you did at 18, but something higher than we have today? And how does one live if one lives in that model? And then, of course, the idea that, you know, half of the population at the moment are actually singles. So how do all those people live if they actually never partner up at all? If we just remain single for our entire lifespan, how does that level of society want to live if they're not having children, for example, as we have fewer children? So at the same time, we were seeing kind of denser ways of living emerge, and co-housing emerged in the 1960s in Denmark. But I was quite inspired by the way they lived in community. And there were some really interesting schemes in Denmark from the 60s forward, where a company called Van Kunsten were kind of a main driver behind the kind of social spaces that were driving community for the Danes at the time. And I suppose I was kind of seeing similarities between some of these things and what we already have in our existing Irish villages. And some of these collectives and the modern ones are pulled together. This is an example of a community room, basically, in one of the Danish schemes, where the families cook dinner. I think it's 3 times a month you cook dinner, and then the rest of the time you're basically coming to food cooked. So living in community can bring completely different ways of supporting each other, which kind of goes back a bit to what Miriam and John were saying about the idea of living and safety and security. And some of these schemes coming together, either them being sustainable focused, or, you know, living working focused, or inclusive design focused. And the idea, I suppose, that in Ireland we very much segment our front and back gardens, whereas in the Danes they much more accept the idea of community as a way of sharing things. Now that kind of might come back to the idea of them trusting government in a different way than we do, but I might leave John comment on that as well. So some of the newer schemes you'll see like multi-story because the need to get denser, but in reality what this is almost like an Irish village condensed into an apartment scheme. And I was beginning to see that. This is Clough Jordan, basically, again, the idea of, you know, there's 3 pubs on the main street, there's a post office, there's a cafe, there's 2 shops, there's a community room, there's 3 schools, there's 3 churches. It was actually called Little Belfast, I believe, when it began, because of the mixing pot of Catholic, Protestant, and different groups here. But I suppose what's trying to be emulated in new build in Denmark is often already available for us here. This is community spaces in some Danish apartment schemes, and this is the community room in the entrance to the Clough Jordan Eco Village, where one gets our vegetables every Monday and Tuesday. So some of the stuff that was already being seen as being futuristic in Denmark, in a certain way, existed already in Irish community here. This was us all moving home back in 2020. So an inspiring section here where you see common areas on the ground floor. Danish affordable housing is looking at combining student, family, senior all in one section. But in reality, and that's being, you know, pumped into dense apartment schemes where the ground floor is something like this. But in many ways, we have that in smaller scales in our Irish cafes and Irish pubs, as they move away from being fully alcohol focused to something which is more community focused. So I completely see that as the future for our hubs in our Irish villages. And that's what's being, you know, touted as the epitome of living in the Danish Scandinavian model at the moment. The young and the old all, you know, combining their social lives, which already happens here in Ireland. So what's emerging then from Denmark is the idea that these kind of community hubs might be themed, as in, how do you entice people out of larger houses? Well, at the moment in Denmark, they're looking at saying, okay, well, you could have a village or a part of a village, which, for example, allows hobbies or community that, you know, are focused on art, for example, or focused on bike repair. So you begin to cluster people around interest. So so what's next for Irish villages? I suppose one of the things that the Danes do very well is something called Cantzone, edge zone. And just to put this a little bit into context for how I see city. So I suppose I see city as organism when you zoom out from it. Now this is Dublin, but it holds true as well for any Irish village. And the idea that we design a cell as architects and put them together into a village or a city in the city body, but the space in between floats like blood, basically. Like the streets are almost like canals of blood that float through the body of the village or the city. And the city, Maximano Fuxas probably in the, I think it was the 70s, spoke about the constantly evolving shape of the city, and the same is true of our villages. So beginning to see the streetscape as part of your everyday life and part of the blood that pumps people through our villages is really important to me. And the idea that we begin to see streetscapes as possible sites, as as the spaces of the future for how our villages evolve. And the idea that you experience space when you go from your house into a bus, into a building, and back again as a continuous series of experiences, if we put it like that. So I suppose that brings me back to the future for Irish villages, which kind of looks a little bit like what Miriam was talking about with the Irish street. And I too think that the curb has a lot to answer for, and the vehicle, in terms of how we are using our Irish villages compared to how we could use the spaces in between, how we could move through our cities. That's our little yellow house there beside the bookshop in Cloughjordan. But you see the width of the streetscape there. At least 6 meters more asphalt that would be needed in the center of the village. So I really see a future for Irish villages where we have to acknowledge that with the arrival of tarmac at and down the middle of the villages, so too came the curb, the street, and drainage as a means of moving water using falls, gullies, and pipes, but has now resulted in this completely over-designed space at the center of our villages, dominated by the car. And the curb has a lot to answer for compared to if this was a shared surface. So I suppose the problem with curbs is that, if I go back to the idea that we're all getting older, it's more difficult to navigate curbs as one gets older as well. And one in four of us moving at the speed where the paving is important rather than the vehicle, it suddenly is a large part of society where vehicular speed is not important to them. So I suppose we see examples like this from Clonakilty and the wonderful work that Julian Valloni did, where moving at speed is less important than moving comfortably. And the idea of understanding how the hierarchy of our public spaces should move from vehicles to public. And the idea that as we look at our villages, we won't necessarily need vehicles to come into town. We'll be looking more at cycles, particularly for that group who are going to remain healthier. These are just examples of how you can tie networks within villages. So kicking it to the curb, if you will, and the reality that we need to move away from the idea that the vehicle is the key driver behind our villages, and even the idea of the curb being the way of separating peoples and cars. Because roads, where we're going, we don't need roads, at least not in their current form, going through the center of our villages. So you could imagine a little bit like Clonakilty did with the bypass route, where vehicles are clustered at the start of villages, and that allows you to free up the center for the people who actually live there. So I think so many times these type of things are blocked by the people who travel through the villages, but the reality is the village belongs to the people who live there, and they should have a large say in how that public space is used. So just examples here of how that car parking could be turned to green space, for example. And together with climate change, this will become a kind of a bigger driver for how our villages need to look at their public space. So everything from permeable paving and how it handles rainfall to greening up our Irish villages in a proper and real manner. So I suppose the only other thing I wanted to talk about then, well, not the only other thing, but the last thing I wanted to touch on was the idea of edge zone and how we relate our housing to our city space. I mean, you'll see in the photo from Cloughjordan there that we often just have our vehicles parked directly up against the paving. And I really see a version where we could begin to reimagine that to be something more like the Danish edge zone in our Irish villages, because we don't need to park in front of our houses, really. And we should be taking back the streets for all. So in that move, I suppose, infrastructure can create city space. So we should be looking at local authorities to be saying, how is that road going to contribute to the community who live there, and have strategies for how we can use it in the time of a market, for example. Even the choice of material can mean that on Saturdays, that street can become something that feels different. We should also see village life happening at different levels as we begin to densify our towns and villages. And I suppose how we move people and things around our cityscape. The other key driver I see coming, and this goes back to our PhD, is the fact that 1 in 10 of us or something like that is going to experience dementia over the age of 80. And dementia, I suppose, if we don't talk about us all getting old, we definitely don't talk about us getting old and having dementia. And that's one of the things the Danes are getting quite good at in terms of how they plan for literally villages where you have layers of security for people with dementia at the center, and then you surround them with semi-secure program to make sure they remain safe, but they're still part of community. And the idea that as you age, you're able to tie into facilities that would exist in our villages to support that aging. You are seeing senior living emerge in Denmark, where a wider social network as we get older is not a bad idea. And the idea of senior and co-living, co-housing schemes moving forward now at speed as a desired way of living. And I suppose that comes against the idea of, do we really want to live out in the countryside on our own for our entire lives? So that's the idea of, you know, your life wish changes as you get older. And this is an example from Copenhagen, where an elderly care home is placed up against a kindergarten with apartments. So everyone just blends their way of living, and it's a wonderful way of living. So moving quickly forward now, the idea that local authorities can support city life by how we provide services in our public realm, and the importance of bringing green into our cityscapes going forward, where you could imagine Irish villages, perhaps not up in 4 levels like this, but the idea behind the cityscape is a good driver for where I could imagine the densification of Irish villages moving towards going forward in Irish towns, where the vehicle is definitely subordinate to public space, and the idea of, you know, owning the space to park your car outside your house will be something of the past in 25 years. Neighborhood level events, multifunctional spaces that people share. These are some images we did for Limerick back in the day before I joined the council. We had some ideas from Copenhagen for how you could take Irish space and work within the idea of it being a rainy environment. And even our small alleyways as art galleries, for example, or in this case, O'Connell Street in Limerick, where if you take out the vehicles and rethink the public space, it's just a completely different ballgame for how one lives in our cities. So I would really love to see that vision realized both in Clough-Jordan, but all of our local Irish towns, where once you break the idea of vehicles going all the way through the village at speed, then it allows a completely different way of living. So I suppose that's where the Danes are at, which is housing for all ages based on lifestyle choices to tempt us from our empty 4-bedroom houses into villages, and free up that for, I suppose, families at a different stage of life, where they're, you know, more open to traveling, and bring us back to community. Yeah, that's what I have for you guys.
Well, thanks very much, Mick. That was very interesting, very broad sweep of ideas about towns and villages and the Danish model. Now, I appreciate some of our guests on the call might have to head off because it's 2 o'clock. But if anyone likes to stick around for a couple of minutes, we can have some questions. John, did you have any response to anything Mick raised there?
Or you're muted, John.
John, you're muted.
Sorry, apologies, technical issues there. A couple of things. Yeah, I think the thing about the people living out in the country is going to be a huge problem. I mean, we're experiencing that ourselves. We live kind of 2.5 acres, about 5 miles out from Westport, and yeah, do we want to move back into town, or what do we do? That is a live issue. The other thing, though, is community. I am a little bit, I suppose, skeptical of community. I'm a bit wary of it. I suppose the easiest way to do it is to give a story. I live in a very mixed family, so like my kids have West Indian heritage and stuff. And to join the group water scheme was actually impossible. We weren't allowed. And I know of other families where there are non-white members in the family, if we put it that way, and they don't get on the water scheme. So community as control can be really difficult. This kind of impetus towards homogeneity in a community, that's where I'd be a little wary of some of that stuff. So yeah, it's just a note of warning, I suppose. Yeah, or caution. Yeah. But okay. No, getting rid of the road through the town. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We had a question in the chat from Sharon McConnell, directed at John. It reads, John, I'd be interested in your opinion on peripheral urban areas on the outskirts of cities versus towns in relation to the issues you spoke about, and if you think same or different historic factors have contributed to urban decline. I think, Sharon, you're getting at cities as well as towns there, John?
Yeah, I mean, there would be, like, I mean, even in Dublin, there's Irish Town, for example, is an area, and it was where there was a huge amount of sewage outfall was pumped out in the bay there, so people couldn't even go swimming and so on. there historically, yeah, there would be these settlements. If you think of Galway, on the way out of Galway, on the Headford Road, you have the halting site is out on the edge of town. There's the industrial estates. There's a kind of another little world is developing on the outskirts, which is pushed out to the edge and to the margins and kind of hidden away. So yeah, I think that has a connection with this kind of apartheid system that was developed in the early development of Irish towns. That there is that kind of notion that we shove things away. In a lot of smaller Irish towns, social housing is shoved out of the way a bit. You don't see it from the centre of the village or town. That kind of idea, I think that's a relic on some level of that kind of thinking. Yeah. Hide the class differences is a big deal. Yeah.
John, I might ask you a quick question just on Westport. Since your presentation was fascinating on the various power hierarchies there, modern Westport, a bit like Clonakilty, it's kind of well known as being very well presented with a lot of positive urban realm interventions.
Yeah.
Would you agree that the modern town population appears to be quite comfortable with the aesthetic, say, heritage, cultural value of the architectural legacy that you've described?
Yeah, comfortable is a great word. Yeah. Westport is kind of strange. Westport has become a retirement town, and has a lot of people who have come from other places, from cities, from England, from America, particularly post-Brexit. There's quite a lot of English retirees. So there's quite a bit of money. And then there's a whole kind of underclass of people who are much less comfortable and again are hidden away, pushed out to the edges of the town, both physically but also socially. So there is that kind of a little bit of tension there. And one of the issues is like people who require services, social services, they tend to go to Castlebar because they don't want to see doing it in Westport. There's a shame of not functioning well in Westport, if you know what I mean. So that kind of issue, yeah. So yes, there is a broad stratum of people in Westport who are very comfortable with the current aesthetics, but it does hide a multitude. Yeah, yeah, it definitely does.
Okay. And then just before we wrap up, there's one comment here on the chat from Caroline Crowley, specifically, I'm very happy these topics are being explored. Imagine Irish society working together towards the shared purpose of some of the ideas in Mick's presentation. John and Miriam's presentations were so interesting for framing the history of Irish towns, and I was curious about what we might need to do to consciously decolonize our towns, from mindsets and systems of extractivism to centralization of domination towards more collectivism, reciprocity, partnership, and so on. Any thoughts on that comment, John or Mick?
Well, sorry, Mick, go on ahead.
Well, I might just shoot from the hip, I suppose, because I suppose one of the things I work with Limerick is affordable housing. So, I mean, I very much see developing medium density affordable housing in Irish villages as a possible lever for enticing people like you, John, back into the village, and the idea that, like, I was at a housing conference last week, I suppose, and it was made quite clear that we'll only move for something we consider to be better. You know what I mean? So we have to make a more enjoyable life for you in the center of Clonmel or wherever it was you were saying, rather than alone. The uncertainty of outside alone. And I understand both, because I have a sheep farm in Northwest Cork in my fingers, but I also have the idea of what is community from Denmark and Cloughjordan. So I would love to see local authorities doing affordable smaller units in the center of Irish villages where the ground floor is very much community based, where there's levels of community, as in you don't have to go down and talk to people you don't want. You'll still have your private apartment or the private roof terrace. So it's about leveling it out, you know what I mean? And then I think it's about definitely Irish villages realizing that, and towns, that you actually have a say in how your central space is. It isn't just the people who drive through, it isn't just the tractors driving as fast as they can with the silage left and right, even though they're a powerful lobby. We live in the village, I live in the village here. We should have a say in how our public space is used. So I'd love to see that getting true in the local authorities.
So any closing comments, John?
Just thanks very much. This was fun. Thank you. Thanks a million.
Well, in that case, 2:10. I think we'll wrap it up. I'd like to thank again our speakers, Mick Bradley, John Malloy, and Miriam Fitzpatrick, for a very, very interesting series of talks. The session has been recorded and will be uploaded to the Centre for Irish Towns YouTube channel in due course. So I would like to invite you all to join us for our May and June sessions, as well as our autumn series this year. So thanks for everybody turning up today. I really enjoyed it. I hope you did too. And I wish you all a very good afternoon.
Thank you.